It's an astonishing announcement of her ignorance of what the organisation of which she was chief executive was actually doing. And I think Sir Win Williams's reaction was a bit of incredulity. How could you not know that your organisation was prosecuting hundreds and hundreds of sub-postmasters? Astonishing. The question is it credible? She was either telling the truth but displaying an incompetence of gargantuan scale, or she was not telling the truth. But there are several days of this to go yet.
Paula Vennells told the inquiry that there was too much trust put in the people who gave her legal advice.
As the inquiry has heard, there was information that I wasn't given and others didn't receive as well. One of my reflections on all of this is that I was too trusting. I did probe and I did ask questions.
Too trusting. Do you buy that? She also acknowledged that what she told MPs and colleagues in one meeting about the prosecutions of sub-postmasters was not true.
Why were you telling these parliamentarians that every prosecution involving the Horizon system had been successful and had found in favour of the Post Office?
I fully accept now that the Post Office, the Post Office knew that. I completely accepted. Personally, I didn't know that, and I'm incredibly sorry.
She broke down in tears when she was asked by Hugo Keith KC, counsel to the inquiry, about the suicide of Martin Griffiths, who was pursued by the Post Office for shortfalls of £60,000.
I phoned the family and I spoke to the father, who explained to me that there were other issues involved. And I imagine that, I imagine that I was probably...
Ms. Venells, just rather than trying to talk through your...
I beg your pardon.
Just pause.
Yes, OK.
Try and compose yourself if you can, and then continue your evidence, please.
Let's now turn to somebody who's really been a very, very important player in getting justice for these sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses. Lord Arbuthnot, Conservative peer. He was a former Conservative MP. He's somebody that's really followed this scandal from many, many, many years ago. He's also a board member of the Horizon Compensation Advisory Board. Lord Arbuthnot, thanks very much for joining us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What do you make of what you've heard so far from Paula Vennells?
Well, it's difficult to know, really. It's an astonishing announcement of her ignorance of what the organisation of which she was chief executive was actually doing. And I think Sir Win Williams's reaction was a bit of incredulity. How could you not know that your organisation was prosecuting hundreds and hundreds of sub-postmasters? Astonishing. The question is it credible? She was either telling the truth but displaying an incompetence of gargantuan scale, or she was not telling the truth. But there are several days of this to go yet. And there are lots and lots of other emails and letters and meeting notes to be put to her, and she's not going to have an easy time.
And she is arguing that she only became aware of the Post Office's private prosecution powers in 2012, even though she had this email before that, back in 2009. Do you think it's plausible that she didn't realise that? I mean, she's obviously an intelligent woman. She's obviously an experienced senior sort of executive. Do you think it passed the smell test, that she wouldn't have known that?
No. I mean, for one thing, I wrote to Moya Green, her predecessor as chief executive, in 2011 and got a letter back from her, from Paula Vennells, talking about the prosecutions. So to say that she didn't know until after she'd written the letter to me about prosecutions, strikes me as being just not credible. Still, as I say, there are lots more things to put to her.
And it's interesting. I mean, her sort of defence is saying the only acceptable answer to the questions you were giving me on this is that I should have known and I should have asked more questions, and I and others who also didn't know should have dug in more deeply on this. I mean, she does seem to. It's interesting that this lack of curiosity and this lack of asking difficult questions, because I'm sure if there were other pressing issues about the business, whether the profits weren't doing so well, she would be asking searching questions. Yet on this issue, it feels like everybody was very supplicant, and nobody wanted to have a curious mind.
Yes, and these were precisely the issues on which the MPs and I were saying, you've got to take this very, very seriously indeed. You've got to ask these questions, because we're being told that there is, for example, remote access from offices underneath Fujitsu, who are running the Horizon program, altering sub-postmasters' accounts without their knowledge. You've got to look into that. And she was saying, no, that's not possible. But how she can have said that, given what we were saying to her directly, I cannot understand it.
I'll just read a couple of messages, Lord Arbuthnot, that's come in from our listeners. Someone's messaging saying, somebody says that they want to see some of these senior people go to prison. Dominic's messaging saying, too much trust in the people advising her, but no trust in the postmasters themselves. That's a very, very good point there. Mike's messaging saying, I don't buy the apology, but I do the tears. I think she's finally realising what havoc she has brought onto people's lives. And if she doesn't play this right, the stakes are going to get much bigger for her even now. Simon's messaging saying, I was too trusting, reminds me of Prince Andrew's I was too loyal argument in the Newsnight interview, and not sure if this is the place for somebody in such a hot seat to start proclaiming their naivety and essential goodness. I mean, clear consensus from our listeners, Lord Arbuthnot, very much agreeing with your position. I'm sure many other people at home are just kind of sort of jaw on floor listening to this. But look, we just had the contaminated blood scandal this week as well. It does feel that we have got, many organisations have got this kind of institutional issue with asking serious questions and probing things sufficiently. And I'm sure questions will also be raised when we get to the end of this about what government ministers did as well. How do you think we can change the culture in our institutions across society to try and make sure these scandals don't happen again? Of course, you can't wave a magic wand and just stop them. But how do you think we can get people to ask more searching questions?
It's an extremely important question. And maybe we need to look at the way that other countries do it. Possibly we need to move away from the adversarial system of trying to blame people and give people permission to blow whistles and to apply perhaps to some sort of central body that can investigate things without too much blame. At the moment, there is a real concern that everybody's going to blame everybody else. And that's just not going to work.
Well, look, Lord Arbuthnot, really grateful for your time. Thank you very much. That's Lord Arbuthnot, who's been a really central player in bringing justice for these men and women who were caught up in this terrible, terrible, immoral miscarriage of justice.